I'm gonna have some slides. So welcome everyone to the first workshop, which is fundamentals of the Unity engine. My name is Young. I'll be representing Ryzen Game Makers Union to host you this workshop. So your first question that you may have right now is, what is Unity? Well, Unity is a game engine. Thank you very much. That was pretty obvious. but but what is a game engine? So in the old days, in the 80s and 90s, when people were making, I don't know, Mario, Zelda, when they want to make a game, they're gonna have to do a lot of things. They have to build a renderer, maybe they have some AI for characters on the screen, and if the game has physics, that will have to be implemented, and audio has to also be implemented, music, and optionally, if the game is a multiplayer game, then the programmers have to code in network code as well. And then, after all those steps, they can finally get to the actual logic of the game, which is the final step. So these are all very complicated stuff, but now we have something called a game engine that will handle a lot of these stuff very competently. And you, the developer, can just focus on programming the actual game itself. So this speed up the process a lot. So to sum up, a game engine is a software development environment for building video games. That's simple. Okay, so but why do we want to focus on Unity specifically? Because it's not the only game engine on the market. Well, the first reason is that it's feature rich. So if you need anything in your game, there is a very likely chance that Unity provides it. It is cross-platform. You can build your game once and then run it on a lot of different platforms, PC, Android, etc., etc. A toaster. That was a joke, by the way. Don't build your game for a toaster. And Unity has a very large community and good support from first-party Unity people. Because I personally have very good experience with Unity support, and the people in the community are very helpful and they're willing to help out everyone. And it is free for the most part. If you are an individual making a video game, then don't worry about the pricing, whatever for now. Just know that it is free. And these are some of the games that was made with Unity. They're very popular within the indie scene. You might recognize them. Cuphead, Ori, Hollow Knight. So, so how do you get started with Unity? These are some of the questions that you might have right now, and this workshop will aim to provide an answer to these questions and provide you with a step to move forward. So what do I need to get started with Unity? Well, the first thing you're going to need is Unity Hub, which is a sort of a centralized hub to manage all of your Unity related stuff, so all your projects, installation, accounts, etc. And of course, the Unity editor is the engine itself. And then you're going to need a code editor. I put it as optional because Windows has a code editor built in, which is Notepad. You can just use that to edit code in Unity, really, but it's not recommended. You can, you shouldn't. So what I use is Visual Studio Code, which is a code editor, and I really recommend it. It's very good, especially with the integration with Unity engine. And you can use some assets. So assets just mean like images or audio files, sprites, something that is put into your game and will make your game pop. And you need an idea to make a game, right? What are you going to make a game about? Is it a platformer like Mario? Is it an RPG? Is it a first-person shooter? What will you be making? And grab some coffee to stay focused because it's going to be a long journey. So let's see. So as I said, you're going to need Unity Hub, and I assume that everyone will have Unity Hub installed. So I'm just gonna walk through it real quick. So just go to Unity's website, get started, and yeah, so it brings you to, so remember when I said it's free, but the site is very misleading without telling you. So you can go to individual, and your personal plan is free. So just click this, and so start here. So agree and download, and then it's going to download an executable, which if you run that will install Unity Hub. So I'm going to start Unity Hub right now. So go to start, type in Unity Hub, and start. Okay. So this is likely not what you're going to be seeing because you probably won't have any of these projects. So these are all the projects that I have created for Unity. So if you look on the left side, there is a tab called installs, and this is where you will manage all of your Unity installation. So if you want to add a new installation of Unity, just click this blue button, add. And so just select whatever the recommended release is. It's usually the latest LTS release, so just leave it as the recommended. Next, and you get this screen. So what is this? So you see all of these platforms, right? These are the platforms that Unity can build to, can export to. So if you want to make an Android game, mobile game, then you will select this. But if you want to make a game for Windows, which is for the most part, you will select this. If you want to make your game for Mac or Linux, just select all of these, then click next, and then agree, and then install. I'm not going to do this because it takes a very long time, and I don't need another installation of Unity on my system. Alright, so once you have your Unity installation, you're gonna want to go to the projects tab, and like I said, you're probably not going to have all of these projects, but so you're gonna want to create a new project. So click this blue new button, and okay, let's see. So you see that it provides a number of templates here. What are these templates? So you can see that we have 2D and 3D in Unity. So Unity is, it started out as a 3D engine, but then it added 2D capabilities, which is what I will be selecting for the purpose of today's workshop. So right now, just focuses on 2D and 3D. Don't worry about all of these templates. We'll talk about them later. So select 2D. So name your Unity project. I'm gonna call it my first ever game. Alright, actually. And we have a location. So this location is just the directory where the project will be stored, and just click create. And this will go ahead and create your Unity project. So earlier I talked about 2D and 3D in Unity and how you can make both 2D games and 3D games in Unity. So we have Among Us, which is a 2D game. It was made with Unity, and entitled Goose Game is also made with Unity and is a 3D game. And then we also have something like Hearthstone, which is sort of a 2D and 3D hybrid. It was also made with Unity. So you see that you can make 2D and 3D game and also hybrid games as well. And I have this image here, which is to demonstrate the differences between 2D and 3D. So basically in 2D is two dimensions. You have an X and a Y axis. So like up and down, up and horizontal and vertical. Okay, so X and Y. But in 3D, you have this extra dimension, just the Z dimension, which defines the depth of the scene. So that's basically the difference between 2D and 3D. In 2D, you only have two dimensions. That's why it's called 2D. You have X and Y. And then in 3D, you have X, Y, and Z. You have that extra dimension that defines depth to the game. And so let's see if my project has finished creating it. Okay, so my project has finished loading or not. Okay, it's finished. So let's see. This is what you are going to see upon starting Unity and loading a project for the first time. So a lot of these panels feels very overwhelming at first, but over time they will be, second nature to you. But you see, the thing with Unity is that there's a lot of little buttons and little and toggles and whatnot. My incentive is that don't worry about them unless you need them. Because me myself, I really don't have any idea a lot of what these buttons do. So if you have to use them, then you worry about them. But for now, just if you're just getting started, just don't worry about them. Right. So these panels, a little tip for you is that this layout by Unity they provide is not set in stone, so you can actually move these around. So if I grab this project panel here, if I grab this and then move it, you can see that it's moving around. So I can put it, say I want to put it here, then it's moved here, right? If I want to put it, if I want to have this a floating window, I can resize it. I can do all sorts of stuff. So yeah, definitely play around with this, see what is your preference, and then say you have a preference, you can actually save it. So let me just customize it a little bit. So project here, I don't know, hierarchy here, whatever, right? And say I want to save this layout so that I can restore to it every time I open Unity. You can go to this top right corner and click on this and then save layout. So it gives you an option to name whatever the layout is. So I'm just gonna say my layout, then click save, and it will save this layout. So every time, say you accidentally screw up, I don't know, move the project here, and you want to restore your layout, just click here, my layout, and it will automatically restore to whatever layout that you save. And of course, if you screw up your layout, just click here, click default, and it will be back to the default layout. So I actually have a layout saved. It's just my name, and it's just my sort of preference of what I want the layout to be. So this is what I'm going to be seeing. But you can see a totally different layout. Just play around with it, see if it fits you, right? So you can see there are a lot of windows, panels here. And if you click on window, on the top menu bar, you can see that there are way more windows. If I go to, I don't know, lighting, there's a window for lighting. And I don't know, if I go to, there's a window for audio mixer. So there's a lot of windows. But for now, when you're just starting out, I want you to focus only on 5 windows. The scene view, which is your sort of game world, something that you can navigate in. Your game view, this is what your player is actually going to see when they play the game. The hierarchy, so the hierarchy just contains the different objects, and we're going to talk about objects in a few minutes, but the hierarchy will show the different objects that is currently in the actual game. The project panel here, this is actually your file structure. So you can see we have a folder called assets, and inside of the assets folder we have a scenes folder. And if I click on the scenes folder, we see we have a sample scene. So this scene is what is presented on the hierarchy here. And finally, we have the inspector. So this is probably the most important panel here because the inspector shows the different properties of an object. So if I click on the camera here, so in our scene when we just create, we have a camera, and if we click on that in the inspector, we see that all of the different properties of this camera. So these are actually components to this camera object, and we're going to talk about components in a few minutes. But the inspector panel shows all the properties that you can change, and it's very, very important that you have this inspector panel always accessible. So let's talk about this sort of file structure first, because what you see here, we have the folder assets, scene, assets folder, scenes folder. These are actually folders in your PC. So if you open up File Explorer and then navigate to your project, so my first ever game, that was the name of my project, you can see that we have an assets folder. Now we have all of these other folders and files, and I wouldn't worry about them for now. So just focus on the assets folder. So instead of these assets, we have a scenes folder, which is the scene. And inside of the scenes folder, we have sample scene, which is this sample scene. So you can see that we have this meta file. These meta files is actually just Unity's way of keep tracking things. So it's like backing up a lot of and version control. So don't worry about meta files right now. And I use Unity and I don't really understand how meta files work. They just there, and I never really bother with them. So just don't worry about them for now. But if you go into your project and you can right click on the project window and create a new folder, right? A new folder, or you can create a script, you can create all of these different stuff. But for today, we are just going to create a folder and a script. So let's see if we create a new folder. It gives me an option to name the folder. So say I want to make a folder to store all my scripts. I just write scripts and I go back into the File Explorer. I see that we have a scripts folder. Yeah, so it is generally a good practice to categorize your project, to structure your project based on categories. So of your scripts will go into the scripts folder, and typically you also have something like an animation folder for all of your animations assets. And if you have sprites, it's typically a good practice to have a sprites folder to store all of your images and sprites, and audio and music, materials, everything else, etc. So it is a good practice to sort of create all of these folders so you can access them easily. So, alright, so earlier I talked about an objects. So what exactly is an object? Well, to put it simply, everything in Unity is an object. So an object is basically just an entity that exists in the game. Right, so we have this main camera that is an object, and say you have your game has a player, so your player is an object. Has enemies, all of the enemies, they're all objects. Even the tree that you see in games, they are also objects, right? Boat, a car, whatever, everything in Unity is an object. So let's see that for the purpose of this workshop, I'm going to be creating a very, very simple game where we're going to have like a little ball at the center of the screen, and it will fall due to gravity. We're going to have some platform, and the ball will be able to move left, right, and jump. So it's a very, very simple concept. and very simple game to get everybody started. So first, I'm going to want to create an object. So how do I do that? Well, if you right click on the hierarchy, here we can see that you have an option to create. So you can create 2D objects, 3D objects, effects, etc. etc. So you can even create an empty object, and this empty object is just there. It doesn't have anything to be rendered, so it's not a tree, it's not a car, but it's just there, and you can do stuff with it, even though it's not something that will be rendered on the screen. But for now, we're going to create 2D sprites and then a circle. And as you can see, upon creating an object, Unity is giving you an option to rename this object to whatever name that you want. So maybe if you have game one have a player, you say player, and hit enter to name your object player, right? And if you take a look at the inspector, so we have a player object. What does the inspector show? The inspector shows the different components of an object. But what is a component? Well, a component, basically, it is something that can be attached to an object, and it will define the different behaviors of that object. So you see here we have two components, transform and sprite renderer. So this transform component is something that is always attached to every object in Unity. If you see, this camera object also have a transform component, and then it has camera component, audio listener, and player object has a transform component and a sprite renderer component. So a transform basically defines what is the position, rotation, and scale of an object. So if I change the position of this player to something like the x-axis to like 1, you can see that it moves to the right, 2, 3, etc. So it defines the position, rotation, and scale of the object. Very simple. So we also have this sprite renderer. So what is the sprite renderer and why is it here? Well, if you recall, when we create the object, you right click and then create a 2D sprite. So every time you create a 2D sprite, it will come with a sprite renderer, and this is basically defines how what will be rendered in your game. And you can see here we have all of these different properties. And what do they mean? Well, I'm not going to go over all of them, but you can see that over on the right corner of the component, there's a question mark button. If you click on that button, it'll actually open up your web browser and bring up the Unity manual. And this, I find it very helpful for if you don't know what what a property does, you can just go to this manual and they'll explain all of that very well. So yeah, even I have no idea a lot of like what these mean, but you can just always go to the manual to read about them. All right. So the sprite renderer defined how this sprite is rendered. So if you want to add a new component, you can see that there is a button here that will add a component to your play object. So let's try adding a component. So if I click on this, it will bring up this interface, and this is the list of all the components that you can add to an object, and they will be categorized, they'll be sorted by categories. So if I select, earlier I said that I'm gonna want this player to sort of fall down due to gravity. So how do I define that behavior? Well, there's a component in Unity, so it's under physics 2D and rigid body 2D. So what this component does is that it just adds gravity to your object. So again, if you have no idea what all of these actual properties need, just click on this question mark. They'll bring up the Unity menu, and it does a very great job of explaining everything. So right now, if we play the game, we'll see the player just sort of fall down and infinitely just fall down for that. So if you want to see that, there's a button here. So play, there's a play button and a pause button. So if you just click on play, it will enter play mode and sort of simulate your game in the game window. So as you can see, the player fall down and it doesn't stop and the game ends. Just like that, right? So let's add some platform at the bottom here, just to catch our player and prevent him from falling to the void. So again, same practice, right click, and then we're going to create a 2D sprites. But this time, we want to create a square because our platform is a square shape. So we'll click that. You see that we have an option to rename it, so I'm going to name it platform. Just like that. And if we go to the scene view, so again, this is the game world that you can sort of navigate in. To sort of navigate the game in the game view, just right click anywhere and you can click and drag. So click and drag, click and drag. Yeah. And to zoom in and out, just you can scroll on your mouse, just scroll in and out. So I'm scrolling up, which is in, and I'm scrolling down, just zoom out. So scroll up, scroll down, click, drag. Very simple. So we have this platform, and we want that platform to be positioned here, down here. Again, you can see that there's a transform component on our platform. So we can just say the position Y is -4, and there we go. We have that platform at the bottom of our screen. You can check that in the game view. Yes, it is indeed at the bottom. And we want our platform to be wider, right? We don't want our platform to be like a tiny little box here that the player cannot walk in. So to do that, we want to manipulate the scale of this platform. Go back into the transform component and just scale it up to, I'm going to scale it up to about 15. Yeah, that looks good. So back in the scene view, we see our platform scale up because we changed the property here. But now, if you play the game, you see that the platform doesn't catch the player at all. Okay, loading. Yeah, so the player will fall right through the platform, which is not what we expected, it's not what we want, right? But why is that? Well, in the player component, we define, okay, we want something that will be rendered on the screen. We want our player to have physics and will fall down due to gravity, but we didn't define that the player should collide with the other objects in the screen, right? Because we don't have any component to say that. Well, so we want to add a new component, and this time I already know what I want, and if you notice, there's a box here that you can type in, and it will search all of the components in Unity and return whatever that you search for. So what I want is a circle collider. So if I type circle, it gives me this option to add a circle collider 2D. Click on that, and it adds a circle collider 2D to my component. And okay, so the list of components is getting very long, and it's getting very cluttered in my inspector. So a little tip for you guys is you can actually click on this component, left click, to collapse them. So collapse. So again, click to expand, collapse, expand, collapse. So it's a neat way to sort of make your inspector a lot cleaner, and yeah, just easier on the eye. So if I go to the scene view, we see that we have a circle collider, but how do we know that? Well, if I zoom in on the object, there is a very thin green border. on this circle. Do you see that there is a checkbox next to the components? You can actually check or uncheck this box to disable the component and enable the component. So if I disable the sprite renderer, so this is enable, disable, you can see that there is a green outline. So this will define that yes, our player now will collide based on this shape. Right, so I'm going to re-enable my sprite renderer. But now, if we play the game, the player will still sort of fall right through the platform. Yeah, so it still fall right through the platform. And why is that? Well, because we have a collider on our player, but we don't have any colliders on our platform, right? So let's add a collider on our platform to define that it should collide with other colliders. So let's add a component, and this time what I want is a box collider. So if I type in box, it gives me 3 options, and I want a box collider 2D. A box collider, so this is the 3D version of this collider, which we will not be using. We just want the 2D version. So if I click that, and it will also add a little outline. If I disable the sprite renderer, we see that there is an outline in our box, in our platform. So these are the areas that the box will collide. And re-enable that, and now if I play the game, you see that the player will indeed fall and will be caught by the platform. Yeah, just like that. So yeah, so that is the basis on the basics on objects and components. So scripting is how you define a logic of the game. So a script is just a special component that is defined by you, by the developer. You will define what is the name of the component and what will it behave. So, and the scripts are typically stored in the assets folder, as I showed you earlier. And again, scripts can be edited using any code editor. And yes, Notepad works as well. So how do we create a script? So if you go into your project window here and have a scripts folder, to go into the scripts folder, again, you can right click, create a C# script. And similar to how we create an object, Unity will give us an option to name the script. So I'm just going to name it layer movement. So this script will sort of define how our player will move. So that's why I named it player movement. And it will sort of and we want the player to move left, right, and jump based on our input, right? So if we go to the file explorer and go to our assets script, you can see that we have our play movement.cs, which is basically this file. And because it is a sort of a script file, you can edit it with any code editor. So if I right click on this file and click edit, it will bring up Notepad, and you can just edit your script using Notepad. And this is 100% doable. It is not recommended, but you can do it. But what I will be using to edit this script is Visual Studio Code, and you can go to Edit and Preferences. So this is sort of the different settings you can change related to the editor. But what I'm interested in is external tools. And you can see that my external script editor is set to Visual Studio Code, and you can click on this and change your preference based on whatever code editor or IDE that you like. So I have mine set to Visual Studio Code. So to open that, I just simply just double click on the script and it will open Visual Studio Code on my second monitor. Okay, hold up here. So we have this script that it's opened in Visual Studio Code. So what does all of these mean? It's very overwhelming at first because this is what Unity gives you by default. You don't have any other option. Okay, what is this? No. Yeah, okay. So we have all of these code, but what do they all mean? Well, for right now, I just need you to focus on two things: start and update. So what do they mean? So start and update are actually Unity events functions, and they are named by Unity and called by Unity. So these start and update functions, you don't have to call them. Unity will call them, and you can see in the comments here, start is called before the first frame update, and update is called once per frame. So when you start the game, Unity will automatically call this start function. And then after that, every single frame that your game is rendered, it will call this update function. So you don't have to call them, Unity will call them because they have the name that Unity has defined. So how do you know that these are Unity events functions and what are the other Unity events functions? Because it's these two are not the only ones. So if you go to the link that in the Unity documentation, we have event functions. Again, I think this does a really great job of explaining everything. And we have, let's see, other event functions. So we have start, update, fixed update, late update, etc. So just go through them. If you don't understand, just click on them and read out them. So, but for now, let's just focus on start and update. And okay, so those are Unity event functions. What else do you need to be able to script in Unity? Well, you're going to need to know the different data types. So if you have programmed before, you probably know about integers. They're just numbers. So 0, 1, 2, 3, minus 1, minus 2. They're whole numbers. And then we have float, which are floating point numbers. So 1.2, 1.3, 1.4. And we have, so there is a special data type defined by Unity. This is called a vector2. So what is a vector2? Well, a vector2 basically just it holds two values, two floating point values, an x and a y, and they just define sort of a point in the world or a direction. So have x defined the horizontal axis and the y define the vertical axis. And we're going to see how vector2 is used in a few minutes. So, and again, so scripting in Unity in a nutshell is broken down into 3 steps. It's a lot more complicated if you really dive into it, but at the most basic level, it's defined in 3 steps. We're going to make a reference to a component. We're going to manipulate a property of a component, and then we're going to call a method on that component. So what does all of these mean? So step 1, refer to a component. So if you go back into my script, if I, at the start of the script, I'm just going to type public rigid body 2D and name it player rigid body semicolon. Right. So Visual Studio Code is not like it is. Okay. So public rigid body 2D player rigid body. So we're going to make a reference to a rigid body 2D type, which is called player rigid body. So that is step one, make a reference to a component. And if I save my script, so Control S to save and go back into Unity, you can see that the Unity editor will automatically recompile and reload all of the script. So it will update automatically. You don't have to click compile or anything, right? So if you see the inspector, we see that it sort of shows as a preview of the script, and we see that there's a public rigid body, player rigid body, something that we added. And if we go to our player, remember, a script is just a component that is defined by you, the developer. So we're going to want to attach this player movement to our player as a component. So again, we can do that easily by adding a component and then searching for player movement, just like that. And if you want to remove a component, just right click on the component and remove component, right? And a little tip for you, if you drag and drop your script onto a player, either onto the player or onto the inspector of the player, it will also do the same thing. It's going to attach the player to, it's going to attach the script to the player component, the player object. All right, so we see that we have this player rigid body. So what is this? It is actually something that we define here, right? We say we make a public field of type rigid body, and it is a player rigid body. It is called player rigid body. So that's why it shows up here as player rigid body. And it is currently none because we haven't defined that what this player rigid body is. So if we click on the player and drag it into this box here, we see that it turns green. This is blue. This indicates that you can let go, and the reference will be made to this player rigid body. So again, click and drag in here, and you can only do this because that the player has a rigid body component attached to it. So if you try and drag in the platform, the platform doesn't have a rigid body component. So if you try and drag the platform in, it's not going to work. You don't see any blue box, and you let go, nothing's gonna happen. But if you try and drop the player in, it will succeed. And so now this player rigid body, this thing here, will be referred to will refer to this rigid body component that we added to our player. So that's step one. You make a reference to a component and then manipulate component properties or call component methods. What that means is if I go back to my script here, so so there is an example of rigid body documentation. If I go to this documentation, we can see that all of the different properties here, angular drag, velocity, etc. So these of the component that you can change, and these coincide with all of these properties here. So you can see, I don't know, mass, and you can probably find mass as a property right here. So you can change the property of the component, and if you scroll down, you see that all these public methods. So these are also the methods that you can call on this component, or something like add force or get points, etc. So if you ever stuck on what these functions do, just click on just go to the documentation and read on them. So go back to my script, and how do you manipulate a property or call a function? Well, you can do that by simply saying player rigid body dot and then whatever method or property. So if I want to manipulate the mass, this is dot mass equals to 0.1, so something like that, right? So this is how you can manipulate a property in Unity. So if I save this, go back into Unity, and we see that we have an error. So it's a red text that shows up in the console window that tell us, okay, what literal double time, whatever. So what does this mean? Well, you can see here that we say 0.1. Well, in C sharp, if your number is a float, you have to sort of define that float by putting an F after that number to say, okay, this is a float. So 0.1 is a float. So if I save this and go back into Unity, wait for it done. So we see that the error goes away, and if I play this, so if I click play, okay, so the player falls down, and if I click on the player, you see that the mass property is now 0.1 because it is something that we set in our script, right? Everybody.mass equals 0.1. So it is something that we set in our script, and it is reflected in the inspector to show that yes, our script did work. So I am going to remove this because I don't want to set my mass to 0.1. What I want to cover next is input, managing in Unity. So how do you read a player input? So I don't know, left arrow, right arrow, spacebar keys, mouse button, whatever. So you can go to the scripting API and just search for input like this, and it will come up with the search result that give you all of these sort of functions and properties. So you can see that you have something like get button that return the whether a button is pressed, get key, whether a key is pressed. So I go back into Unity and I want to use that. So and to query for an input, simply use the if statement. So first I want to jump, right? I want to jump by pressing the spacebar key. So if I check for whether the spacebar button is clicked or is pressed, if input dot get key down, and again go back into our scripting API. What does get key down mean? I click on here. It gives me an option. Okay, static pull get key down, and it takes a string as an argument. So this is also, we have examples and all these descriptions over here. We can also use something key code to so we can either use the string space or the key code space to query for input. So I'm going to use key code dot space. Right. So now that we have checked for input, what do we want to do in this input if the space button is pressed? So what I want is to jump, right? Which is player rigid body add force. And again, if you don't know what something does, just go back into the Unity documentation, I think, and I'm gonna go to rigid body documentation, public methods, and we see that there is an add force method that apply a force to the rigid body, which is what we're looking for. So I click on that, we see the documentation. It takes a vector 2 of force and then a force mode, which is default, to force mode 2D dot force. So it's something that we don't have to worry about, just this force mode. But what we do worry about is vector 2 force. So again, so we want to pass in a vector 2 to this function method. Okay, so new vector 2, vector 2, and then so inside these parentheses, remember a vector 2 has two values, an x and a y value, right? So here we're going to say something like x comma y. So these two will define what how the force should be applied to a rigid body. So the x defined what is the force, how will the force be applied horizontally, and the y will define how will the force be applied vertically. So because we only want to jump up, the horizontal value will be 0. And remember, we have to put the f after 0 to say that it is a float. And then for y, we're going to want a positive number because we're jumping up. Right? If we're jumping down, then it is a negative number because the vertical axis is defined that way. So for y, I'm going to say something like 400. Put an f after that to say that it is a float. And we go back into Unity. Wait for the script to reload. Okay, and if I hit play, you see that the player will again fall down due to gravity, then be caught by the platform, and if you click, if you press the spacebar key, you see that the player jump because we added a force to our player, and the horizontal axis is 0, so the player doesn't jump left or right, but he will again jump up. And so we want to move left and right now, right? So how do we do that? Again, we're going to say if we put get key down, key code dot left arrow, and we want the player to move left. So we're going to I'm just going to copy this because I'm too lazy. But so now if one want to move left, we just minus because it is moving left, which is the negative on the horizontal axis, so it's going to be minus, and I'm going to say something like minus 5, and then we don't want to move vertically, so it's going to say 0. So I'm going to save the script, go back into Unity. Okay, if I'm going too fast or you have any questions, just shout at me. Okay, play. So we can jump by spacebar, and then if I click left, you can see that the player does indeed move left. So yeah, and he falls down to the wood. Okay. So yeah, I think that. So if you want to move right, just copy this and put it here, and then change this to right arrow, and then change this to a positive number, and the player can move right. So yeah, that is the intro to how to script with Unity. If you are stuck on any of these problems, You can just search it up on Google, and there's a very likely chance that someone will have already stumbled upon your problem, and they'll probably found an answer already. So just search it up, or you can ask in the Unity forums on Stack Overflow, or you can add in the GMU Discord. We have a lot of people here, myself included, who are very, very willing to help you out with any problem or any questions, concern, whatever. And so where to go from here? I have covered the very, very basic of Unity and very, very basic of scripting in Unity. So if you want to take your game development skill journey to the next level, I recommend the Unity Learn portal or Unity documentation and scripting API. They provide very good explanation on stuff. And some of my favorite YouTube channels is the way that I personally learned Unity in the first place was practice. They provide some really good sort of tutorials and stuff. And last but not least, the Game Makers Union. We are planning, I think as Victor said earlier, we are planning many different workshops that provide a wide range of topics. So stay tuned for some updates if you want to learn more. I think that concludes our workshop today on the fundamentals of Unity. Thank you everyone for tuning in. We can have a little bit of time for networking questions and answering some questions. Yeah, thank you everyone for tuning in.